So, welcome to today's podcast. Thanks for joining me. As always, really appreciate your listening to this podcast and hopefully getting tremendous value on it. And this is the joy I get out of this type of podcast, is to bring on unique guests with different expertises and experience to share and hopefully broaden your horizon. So today I'm fortunate to have Antony Jaffee. He's the chairman of Sterling Trustees, and I was chatting with him before we started, and we come back from the Philly roots, so we got to talk about that, and hopefully we get a Super Bowl win coming up soon. But he's the chairman, and I love when I'm looking at the Sterling Trustees website, the power of independent thinking. And this is what we really encourage for our listeners here. So, Antony, thanks for joining me on today's podcast. I'm looking forward to learning more about you and your business. So, welcome.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were just joking, and I said in the world of trust administration, which again, we're going to have you to share more about that along the way. But just like me being in the financial space, I came into it into life insurance, was probably the last thing I ever assumed I would ever get into in my life. So tell folks kind of maybe briefly, how did you what was your journey like, and how did it get you to kind of the Sterling Trustees Corporation?
Yeah, no, I probably never thought I'd land up here either. I guess, a CPA by training, and did my 2 years with one of the big six accounting firms, hated it, and then actually spent about 15 years in investment banking. And my dad actually was a practicing trust and estates attorney and had really developed a practice around helping wealthy families set up trusts. And what ended up happening was he became the independent trustee to a lot of the families. And so over a period of years, built up to a point where he had about $800 million of assets that he was personally responsible for. Started thinking about succession planning, and what happens if he got hit by the proverbial bus, and he wanted to make sure the clients were taken care of. And so he thought about creating a corporate trust company and moving all the assets out of his name into this entity, and then try to grow it from there. Anyway, to make a long story short, he got it all set up, and he quickly realized after setting it all up that he couldn't run his legal practice and the trust company because of all the fiduciary and now regulatory risk that he had to deal with. And that sort of created the opportunity for me. He called me, I guess it was the end of '07. It was the market was going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
Like a good time to get out of the investment banking world into a more sort of recurring revenue business. And so I decided to join him, and here we are 17 years later.
Wow. Hard to imagine, right?
Yep.
Sometimes opportunity knocks when you're not really expecting it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly
Yeah,
right.
that's
Exactly right.
crazy. That's
So,
wonderful. That's
yeah.
wonderful. Well, obviously you're doing something right. You've been in business for this long. And so it's interesting looking over your company, learning more about it. But before we get into some of the details, I mean, when people hear trust, it can spark a lot of unique things in people's minds. I know most of your most of your clientele probably are wealthy or families, but can you just share just on your own sort of your definition, kind of what are trusts and why do they even matter? Right? And why should we even be caring about this?
Yeah. No, listen, trusts are a great vehicle to be able to hand down a family legacy, whether you've made money in the stock market or from a family business that you've sold and whatnot, and want to make sure that those assets are protected for multiple generations and not sort of given directly to your kids who may blow all that money and nothing left of your legacy. And so trusts really can be used to do that. But trust can be used for other things as well. I mean, it's not always high net worth, ultra high net worth families. It's even somebody that's saved $1 million and they've got a kid that doesn't know how to handle money, and they're worried that if they leave him $1 million, he's again going to spend it in 6 months. But trust is a great way to protect it and make sure that he gets a steady stream of income, but doesn't blow through all the principal and all the hard work that maybe his parents had put in to achieve saving $1 million. Can be protected for not only for their kids, but their kids and so forth, if managed correctly.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I don't know if you came across it. I heard someone, I think he's a former investment banker, or he could be still, but he wrote a book called Die with Zero. And basically, obviously spending more while you're alive, but like leaving nothing for the next generation,
Yeah.
right? In terms of it. So it's an interesting concept. And we're talking about the polar opposite. Like we want, generations to thrive and not just spend money, but utilize resources wisely over lifetimes, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously the bigger the trust, I mean, it definitely does come with issues. I mean, for the beneficiaries, if you're a 20-year-old and you're getting income distributions from a trust, it's a great way to sort of stifle your ambition in life and have no motivation to go get a job and whatnot. And part of being a trustee is how do you deal with that and how do you work with beneficiaries to ensure that they are functioning members of society and not sort of leaning on trust income or distributions from the trust to maintain their lifestyle. And that's a big risk. When what we find is a lot of this is really what the parents have instilled in their kids in terms of their values and their values around money, and do they respect money, or was money something that they want to spend and can't get enough of? And so there's a whole myriad of factors there, but it really makes for some interesting dynamics when you deal with wealthy families.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, you talk about wealth, and it can be the hyper focus can just be on the money aspect, but yeah, I suspect you get into a lot of other things to your point around how they use those resources properly and for good and adhere to kind of what these trusts are trying to help support.
Yep.
It's bigger than just the money, right? What you do with it and kind of maybe how you contribute, however the parents, I guess, really want to sort of instill in their kids. So it becomes bigger than that, and that's kind of what you help with.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely what we help with. And sometimes the parents just aren't good parents. I mean, they've been successful at business and maybe that's where they've spent all their time and maybe haven't spent enough time with their kids instilling some of these values. And sometimes we get left sort of, I don't want to say left holding the bag, but it's our job as trustee to be able to communicate with the beneficiaries and try to get them to understand what a trust is, how it works, how the underlying investments work, so that they start to get a better education that maybe they got from their parents who were just focused on creating the wealth.
Yeah, yeah. So at basic level, and then again, estate planning, which I don't know what the stats say these days, but I think there's probably a huge percentage that don't even have a basic estate plan in place, let alone having any level of trust in their families.
Yep.
But for people who at least have some basic trust, maybe a revocable living trust, something basic like that, they're asked to name their trustees. And so typically who's that? Like a family member or, I don't know, banker or CPA or advisor or something, right? So talk more about that, because I don't even think most people even think about it too deeply or even include those people into the conversation. But and why is someone like your company kind of a different sort of option?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, listen, when you're creating a trust, whether it's a revocable trust or a living trust or whatever, when you're putting your will or estate plan together, I mean, listen, a lot of people doing that in their 30s, they're about to have kids and they want to make sure that all the loose ends are tied up and they're not thinking about creating wealth and what happens when they die and trust gets funded. And so what do? They name oldest kid or aunt, uncle, brother, sister into these roles. And for a lot of them, they think, well, it's really nice that they trust us with this money to do it. But, what they're not thinking about is a lot of these people are the same age as you. And so when you're ready to die, they're probably close to doing it themselves. B, a lot of them just don't have the experience. I mean, it might be an honor to be in that position, but they don't understand investments. They don't understand trust taxation. They don't understand just the psychology of dealing with kids and money and whatnot. And so they potentially put themselves into, a difficult situation and a risky situation from a legal perspective. You open yourself up to getting sued by the beneficiaries if you're making bad decisions or don't do something that they're expecting. And so where we come into play is we're an independent corporate trustee. We purely act as a trustee. We don't manage any assets ourselves, and therefore eliminate all the conflicts of interest that exist at most bank trust companies. And families want us to make the distribution decisions so that they've got somebody independent doing that's not tied to the family or doesn't have. You may have it might be an aunt or uncle, and they have a great relationship with the oldest son, but don't really know the other two kids, and so they may play favorites or whatnot. So there's so many different dynamics that can happen there that families just don't think about, where our services really come into play.
Yeah, and you can just be that objective sort of party, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
In it, which is always tricky when we're talking about anything finance. You kind of people always have that probably in the back of their heads, like, what's their incentive
Yep.
here?
Yep.
What helps
That's
drive
exactly
what
right.
they do?
And That's exactly right. I think the incentives really get screwed up especially when you're naming family members. Children, oldest son, youngest daughter has to go to oldest son to get a distribution from a trust, and he says no. I mean, it just leads to a whole lot of family conflict and strife that really is unnecessary and can really be avoided by having an independent third party that knows what they're doing and is experienced in the investment side, the tax side, the accounting side, the legal side of trusts.
So it's interesting, and I don't want to get maybe into it because I know you can set trusts in different states, and there's a whole bunch of different unique. We probably won't have time to go into there's a lot of unique types of trusts, but like I saw that you guys are based in South Dakota. Kind of, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like what is the advantage of that? Why did you do that?
Yeah. So there's probably 5 or 6 states today in the U.S. that really have very favorable trust laws, and South Dakota probably is the most progressive when it comes to that. So we knew for our clients who are sort of all over the world, we really wanted to bring sort of the best trust law to bear, and South Dakota provides that. So some of the big things that our clients are looking for: one, there's no state income tax or capital gains tax in South Dakota, so the trust assets can really grow state tax free and state capital gains tax free. So that's a huge opportunity, especially for families that live in, say, California or New York, where you're paying in excess of 10% on state capital gains and state income tax. You basically can pound your money in South Dakota at those rates, plus whatever growth you can get in the trust. So it's a huge tax benefit. And then there's other things that our families are looking for. One is asset protection. Once assets are in trust for a couple of years in South Dakota, they really become bulletproof for creditors. When we're talking creditors, most of our families look at it as, listen, I don't know who my kids are going to marry, and one day they may try to come after the trust and whatnot. And with South Dakota, it's really sort of locked down and protected. The other thing is just privacy. So in South Dakota, there's 2 things that really affect privacy. One is, in most states, at the age of 18, you've got to notify the beneficiary of the existence of the trust. They're entitled to get statements and whatnot. So you can imagine, again, 18-year-old kid going off to college finds out they're the beneficiary of a $5, $10, $100 million trust. Great way to sort of stifle their ambition and whatnot. And South Dakota's silent as to that. So South Dakota, you can say, listen, I don't want my kids learning about this trust until they're age 40 and they're functioning members of society. So for a lot of families, that's a great benefit. The other is, a trust is never to be made part of a lawsuit. In South Dakota, you can have that trust permanently sealed. And where that is helpful is, again, let's say your child who's a beneficiary marries somebody and they land up in a divorce, and now ex-outlaw wants to get their hands on the trust and try to get some income or distributions from it, thinking that, well, we lived off of it while I was married, why shouldn't I be entitled to some of this income? And South Dakota will shut that down. The trust is permanently sealed. The thing will never see the light of day. And so it really helps to protect sort of wealthier families from their kids marrying bad people.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, so you would be, and you're probably working, and maybe there's, when you describe the types of families or situations that you're working in, I mean, how would you describe that? I mean, because as listeners or maybe business owners or people high net worth are trying to maybe think through if they would benefit from having a third party in this, like what does it look like in terms of the typical situations or families you're working with?
Yeah, well, I would say that there's nothing typical. I mean, every family is different, and it's really interesting to see sort of how money affects certain types of families and whatnot. But again, I think for anybody that's accumulated wealth and has worked hard for it and want to ensure that their legacy continues for not only their kids, but their kids and so forth, trusts are a great way to protect that and make sure that you could do good for potentially multiple generations. And I think that's where we come into play, where obviously we're chartered. We don't age out like an individual trustee would, so there's stability there. And you're taking advantage of the great South Dakota trust laws over time as well, which are huge. But yeah, I mean, for any family or family that's starting to create wealth or thinking about their legacy and are in the position to put a will together and start thinking about this kind of stuff. I mean, these are questions that you should be asking is, could a trust work for my family? Where should I set it up? How? Who would be best to serve as a trustee? And these are all sorts of questions that just a lot of people just don't know the answers to. And that's where working with a good financial advisor such as yourself, I mean, you can guide them and whatnot. We're obviously here to be a resource to families as well in terms of if they've got questions, we're happy to answer them and walk them through that type of stuff. And our referrals are coming from financial advisors and attorneys that are working with families, understand the issues, and believe that having an independent corporate trustee would be beneficial to the family.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because there's a lot of, just like you can name virtually any field or area within finance, there's always misunderstandings or misconceptions about a given topic.
Yep,
I
yep,
would imagine I hear it often enough around trust. So I'm never going to have an estate tax problem, right? That's usually what I hear too. Why do I even bother, right?
yep,
It's the point. And I think we hit on it that it's a lot of it's more than just about the money aspect and saving on taxes.
yep, yep.
It's how the next generation sort of essentially, I don't know, do you guys do some like even education and teaching and kind of trying to have that sort of role within families? Because maybe it's hard for them, they don't even know how to teach it to their kids.
Yep. Yep. No, we do that. We almost give beneficiaries incentives. If you want to get a monthly distribution, okay, you need to use Quicken to manage your finances, and you need to show us on a monthly basis what you're doing and whatnot so that we can see that you are responsible and whatnot. It's not something we would do for every family, but there are some parents that are concerned about their kids and want to put these incentives in place to make sure that these kids are learning about money and learn to respect it over time and ensure that if they're getting a distribution, they don't go out the next day and buy a Lamborghini or a Porsche and blow it. So, yeah, so that's a big thing about what we do is really try to teach that next generation how to respect money and value it going forward.
Yeah, and that's a tough, I think that's just a broader, challenge that I think most people face. I know I didn't grow up, my parents didn't know what the heck they were doing, so it's probably a good thing they weren't sharing a lot with
Right,
me
right.
because they probably would have steered me in a bad direction. So I guess it's in some cases maybe better for them not to teach you if they don't know. But to me, I definitely see it in my world where it's just a lack of knowledge or even a taboo topic, right?
Yep,
It's just like inappropriate.
sure.
I think they'd rather talk about, which kind of relate to this. They're okay to talk about dying more than finances or anything
Yeah,
like that. It's
yeah.
crazy, but
No, it's a good point. I mean, and this sort of just goes back to the values that the parents instill. I mean, I would tell every parent, like, as soon as the kid's 7, 8, 9 years old, like teaching them how to save or giving them an allowance and expecting that in return for that, they're going to clean the dishes or take out the trash and whatnot. I mean, it's just little things like that that accumulates over time when you're a kid, that you get to 15, 16, you get your first job, you sort of understand how to save money and how to use a bank account and all that kind of stuff. It's just really, really important to get kids focused on that and understand it. It really is just critical to their ability to respect money on a going forward basis.
yeah, yeah. What are some things? I mean, I know we're kind of on the front end of a new administration coming on board, and a lot of people, certainly the world of people trying to mitigate taxes and all these things. So, anything coming on the horizon that may impact kind of your area around trust administration and trust in general?
Yep. I would have said if Biden would have stayed in office, there was the potential for a lot of the tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 potentially going away, and the lifetime gift exemption, which is now, I guess, 13 million and change, potentially getting cut to 3.5 million. And I think that could have caused some chaos and a lot of people thinking about financial planning and, what do I do to protect that? But my sense is with Trump, I don't think that lifetime gift exemption is going to go anywhere. So families still have $26 million between husband and wife in terms of assets that they can still hold without paying any estate tax. So the question is, do you want to give that, let's just say you die with 25 million between you, do you want to give it directly to your kids, or do you want to put it in trust and protect it for multiple generations? It's, I think a question that a lot of families will have to ask themselves.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess you've probably seen it where because you're working closely with estate attorneys or advisors, accountants, etc. Because I would imagine most people are, for the most part, I would think, aren't really thinking of this for themselves,
Yep.
right? So I would assume that's typically how they kind of you come into play when these other partners in your world maybe bring it up, and then that's how you gotta start the conversation of whether an independent group like yours could help. What is,
Pros
as
and
it relates to the trust in general, and I know you might have to come into
hello.
situations where things get ugly. What are things that you have seen over your history that, outside
Can you
of
hear me?
lack of education, but what are they doing wrong as they're even creating their trusts and getting their legacy planning together? I know this is a challenge for a lot of families, and I know this is where your company can play a role around helping at least to help educate future generations and kids, because that it can be a very sometimes uncomfortable conversation for families. So, and that's a kind of role that you and your organization can help play to some degree in concert with maybe the estate attorney,
Yeah.
right? So it's a
Yeah.
very vital role that could be having sometimes a third party. Like I sometimes joke with my kids, when I tell them one thing and the same other person tells them the same thing, they'll listen to them.
Right.
So sometimes having a third party with some street cred is helpful.
I think that's
Right.
absolutely right. As you said, for some families, talking about money is sort of a taboo thing, and I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer. I mean, I've seen families that don't talk about it, don't really let their kids know what's going on in these trusts, and when they get to 40, 50 years old, that's when they start to introduce it. And then there's some families that are transparent and from day one, and kids learn to respect money that way as well, as they see how their parents behave around money and whatnot. So there's so many machinations here, and there's not one right or wrong way to go about doing it. But I do know that it's just really important for parents to instill good values in their kids, because if they don't have that, everything else sort of goes out the window, sort of
Right.
further in life, particularly around money.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's having the courage to just even talk about it, and even if you're not, you know, confident yourself, but we're getting help from
Yep.
others who might be able to fill in gaps. And but I think it gets easier every time you talk about it, or just like anything, you get on the bike, it sucks the first time, but you
Yep.
get used to it,
Yeah.
right? Just like
No,
anything.
there's nothing
So
bad about being transparent.
yeah, yeah, and it's certainly when it's heartfelt and it's for it's for the good, right?
Yep.
Trying to set them up to succeed and support them.
Yep.
On that note, too, maybe this is kind of the last things I'm really curious more from when you're getting involved. Like, what are some of the I think you kind of alluded to a few of them, but like, what are most families maybe getting wrong as they're sort of designing their estate plan and helping getting their trust sort of set up? Is there any big things that people should avoid or are doing wrong when it comes to that? Anything that you could share around that topic?
Yeah. Uh, I find sometimes people sort of try to over-engineer their trust
Mm,
and estate plans. Like they're thinking about every machination of what can go wrong, and they have so many rules and whatnot that they've laid out in the trust that I just tell people it's really hard to rule from the grave. I mean, you've obviously created some wealth, you put a trust together, and you want to make sure that it's going to take care of multiple generations if possible. And sometimes you just have to leave it in the professional's hands to be able to do that and make sure it's done effectively and whatnot. And sometimes you can just over engineer it and have too many
mm,
things going on that it screws up the whole purpose of what you're trying to do here. So I think if you have a good trustee that doesn't have any conflicts of interest and knows what they're doing and are professionals, they'll be able to do what they're supposed to do as a trustee and make sure that the next generation is taken care of, but also as a trustee should be thinking about their kids and whatnot, so that if you're making a distribution during their lifetime, you're also thinking about the next generation and how this potentially affects them. So my best advice, try not to over-engineer it, I guess.
yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And I think as I've gotten older and hopefully wiser, I don't know, my wife may differ with that, but I think the simpler is better. And what's that 80-20 rule? Like,
Yep.
really, most things probably don't even matter
Right.
all that much and get to the really heart of it. And hopefully you get that squared away and planned properly.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and the rest will be okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Anthony, this was super informative. I think trying to dispel some of the sort of maybe noise around estate planning, trusts, and all this, I think is important because there's probably a lot of families, given the wealth that's been built in this country and across the world, that could benefit from services like yours. So, how would, if someone were interested, how would they, best to kind of connect with you and your team to see if there's a good fit in terms of what you guys provide?
Yeah, so people just go to our website, which is www.sterlingtrustees.com, and there's a wealth of information on there regarding trusts, how they work, and different kinds of trusts. And so there's a lot of education stuff on there, and they can just reach out to me directly. My name's obviously it's Antony Jaffee, and they can reach me on my email at ajaffe@sterlingtrustees.com, where they can just call me directly at 610-234-0626, and happy to answer any questions that they have. I mean, obviously it's a very sort of educational type sell, and it's usually multiple go-rounds and questions and whatnot. So that's the role that we play, is to try to educate families on this so that they feel comfortable that they're making a good decision.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I love that. And we are definitely all about education, and I call it empowerment. And I love that, the power of independent thinkers. I might have to steal part of that
Sure.
thinking. But yeah, that's what we want people to do, and just get around the right people, and folks plan, right? Get ahead of these things, because we never know when things will happen and change quickly. And I'd rather be 30 years early than 5 minutes late. So get ahead of it. So Antony, thank you for your time, wisdom, and really grateful to have met you. And I'm glad you're in the Philadelphia area. So you already got 1+ in my
Yep.
mind. So
Yep.
thank you.
All right.
Thanks for joining me. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining me on this episode today. I really am grateful for you as listeners to the Perennial Pride podcast. I hope you're getting some tremendous value out of it, and hopefully pushing you along your journey to financial freedom. I put this podcast together really to help you get more educated around your finances, so that you feel empowered to live the life that you really want. And if you like the content that you heard today or watched, then I would encourage you to go to my website, perennialpride.com. There's tons of other content there. And you can access my book, Wealth Beyond the Numbers. You can buy it there on my website. It's a aggregation of a lot of great tips and tools I've learned to not only build my wealth in my accounts, but build wealth in my life, and abundance and joy, and something that has a lot of my experiences in the journey that I've been on personally. Hopefully that can be also of value to you as you sort of move forward. So thanks again for being a Perennial Pride listener, and we'll see you on the next episode.